Welcome back. In the previous lecture, we studied 4 concepts from ancient and classical rhetoric that can readily and effectively enhance the quality of your writing. We learned how identifying and incorporating commonplaces into our work can help us establish a sense of solidarity with readers, and how that solidarity, in turn, can allow us to better explore alternative or opposing points of view. We also learned about the concept of stasis, when opposing parties agree on the terms of an argument, and how a lack of stasis can forestall an argument's resolution. Recall that I suggested that you don't necessarily have to change your position on an issue in order to achieve stasis, but your writing can be more persuasive if you use your knowledge of the situation to clarify for your readers the problems and the tensions that prevent stasis from occurring. In other words, sometimes the best thing writers can do for their audiences is to explain precisely why a particular argument never seems to move any closer to resolution. Finally, we looked at the processes of deductive and inductive reasoning, both of which are meant to help us use the knowledge we already possess to discover something new, and they're essentially 2 sides of the same coin. We saw how deductive reasoning begins with a general premise or pre-existing theory and then uses it to explain the meaning of particular events or occurrences. And we learned about inductive reasoning's capacity to use bits of evidence, surveying and comparing them, to then generate a broader explanation about how the world works. The goal of this lecture is to enlarge the critical frame we've created through our study of commonplaces, stasis, and inductive and deductive reasoning in order to better illustrate and explain 2 broader areas of ancient classical rhetoric. And here I'm talking about invention and arrangement. In other words, we're going to enlarge what I like to call our rhetorical toolkit. We'll look at how elements of invention and arrangement can help us build and present stronger arguments, especially in the areas of business and professional writing. Now, invention is a rhetorical term that refers to the process by which we generate arguments, meaning how we come up with the topics and questions we write about. When business management gurus urge people to, quote-unquote, think outside the box, or consultants advise companies to brainstorm new ideas, they're really asking for versions of what we call invention, even if they don't realize that that's what they're doing. Arrangement is a rhetorical term that refers to the way arguments are organized. It's pretty much just what it sounds like. Arrangement is the formulas and the expectations that dictate the way a piece of writing is structured or worded. The classic 5-paragraph essay or the genre of the formal business letter are all examples of formula-based arrangement. We all know what these pieces of writing are supposed to look like, and we then shape our work to fit those expectations. Rather than thinking outside the box or brainstorming, I'd like you to do what the ancient Greeks did when they were involved in the invention process and needed to generate ideas and arguments. First, consider the kairos of your situation. Kairos, spelled K-A-I-R-O-S, for our purposes today, refers to the opportunities that a particular set of circumstances might present to you. And it also refers to the need to time your response so as to make the most of whatever opportunities have presented themselves. In other words, if you put it simply, kairos is really about saying or writing the right thing in the right way at the right time. One more time. Kairos is about saying or writing the right thing in the right way at the right time. But first, you have to be able to spot these kairotic opportunities in order to really make the most of them. Anyone involved in the world of finance, the world in which the mantra is always buy low, sell high, knows that kairos can mean the difference between turning a handsome profit and taking a major hit or loss. If the timing's right, the market can make you rich. If the timing is off, Not only will you miss out on the opportunity to make gains with your portfolio, but you might then leave yourself vulnerable to a downturn. Kairos was so intriguing and significant for ancient rhetorical figures that the idea was manifested in the form of an actual mythical creature. The surviving depictions of Kairos show a human form in what we'd call, I think, a precarious balancing act. It's trying to grasp new opportunities without losing hold of what he already possesses. Kairos is also depicted with a rather unique hairstyle. There are long locks above the forehead, clear of the eyes, that seem to imply a need to stay vigilant for something good and to reach for it before the moment passes. Kairos was also a way for ancient thinkers to acknowledge that the circumstances from which ideas and arguments emerge are not always static or fixed, but rather they're always kind of in flux. Each situation carries with it a unique set of possibilities and limitations, all of which have to be studied, monitored, and to which you constantly have to adjust yourself in order for an argument to be successful. It's really kind of about a super heightened awareness of a particular situation. Now you might be thinking, and you would be right if you were thinking this, that there's a certain amount of luck involved here. Let's just be honest about that up front. It's really not often that we discover the perfect paragraph for a particular writing task and that we then deliver it at the perfect moment to achieve maximum success. President Abraham Lincoln managed to do it with the Gettysburg Address, which is proof enough that Kairos is an elusive quality that most of us don't manage to fully capture in our writing processes most of the time. You might have heard the story that Lincoln composed the speech totally in the moment on the back of an envelope while riding the train to Gettysburg. Most scholars now believe that this, in fact, is not the case. Lincoln had been working on and crafting the speech for some time in advance of giving it. But still, talk about Kairos. In one of our nation's darkest hours, Lincoln managed, in the space of just 271 words, to invoke the principles on which the United States was founded, address the trauma of the current Civil War, and then provide a vision, a way to move forward. The opening of this speech, with its formality and what you might call a kind of epic historical tone, seems itself drawn from the world of classical rhetoric and its practices. And you probably all know this opening, but let's listen to it and be thinking of the Kairos of this moment as you listen. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. He acknowledges the moment in which he finds himself compelled to provide such a wrenching memorial. But instead of a simple honoring or a consecration, he takes this opportunity. He recognizes the Kairos. He takes this opportunity to provide his audience with an idea of what could come next. And he emphasizes that this really is a chance, it's an opportunity to learn from this horrible situation and make the United States something new and better than what it had been before. He then goes on to say, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It's a brilliant piece of oration with images, rhythms, and cadences that have made it one of the most studied pieces of text in the whole American literary tradition. Lincoln's understanding of the kairos of the situation in which he found himself, whether or not he consciously recognized this specific classical concept, is a wonderful illustration of how kairos should function. Kairos needs to be part of our writing toolkit insofar as it serves to remind us that each writing situation is unique in some way, however slight, and that when we're in the middle of the process of invention, or if you want to call it brainstorming or outside-the-box thinking, whatever you prefer, we'll do ourselves a huge favor if we attend as closely as possible to each situation's contingencies, demands, and opportunities. Put another way, never assume that one writing moment is the same as another, and always enter into each writing task without a preconceived notion or certainty of what argument you'll make or exactly how you'll make it. So the key to coming up with that new idea or argument is to pay careful attention to the circumstances you find yourself in, and always be prepared to adjust your topic or alter your position slightly depending on what new information is coming your way. Just as a good financial advisor warns a client not to get emotionally invested in a particular stock so that he or she fails to recognize that market conditions have really shifted and that stock that you like so much is really no longer worth owning, so too does a good writing advisor warn students not to become so attached to a particular idea or argument that they fail to recognize when its value or its relevancy has dissipated or, in fact, disappeared entirely. Please don't mistake my meaning here. I'm not suggesting that the concept of kairos requires you to change your core beliefs or take a position that undermines your own ethical or moral standards. Kairos is not at all about that. In fact, one of the benefits of maintaining a flexible stance and an awareness of changing circumstances is that it puts you in a better position to articulate and circulate those beliefs and standards should the opportunity present itself. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is a prime example. Nothing about the conditions under which the address was written or delivered changed any of Lincoln's core ideas and beliefs about the nation and the war. But those conditions did give him an opportunity to express those ideas and beliefs in a much more powerfully moving way than he ever had before. One of my colleagues several years ago wrote a book on the subject of 19th century literary representations of terrorism in American culture. And the timing ended up being such that this book was actually published just in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks. Now, absolutely none of the book's research dealt directly with 9/11. Nearly all of that work was completed prior to the attacks happening. And my colleague chose not to change or supplement any of his core arguments as a result of 9/11. He believed very strongly in the conclusions he had reached and saw nothing associated with 9/11 that would have changed his core ideas about the role of terrorism in American culture. But at the same time, my colleague was keenly aware of the kairotic quality of the moment, not because he sought to exploit the timing to sell more books, but because of the country's new and heightened awareness of the issues that he'd been working on for so many years. And this allowed him to articulate his research in a more powerful and persuasive way than would otherwise have been possible. The fact that he was able to maintain a flexible stance and an awareness of changing circumstances did not mean he shifted his core arguments. Instead, this flexibility and this awareness gave him the opportunity to express those arguments more persuasively and to reach a wider audience. Now, this is not at all to say that he refused to incorporate aspects of the experience of 9/11 into his discussions of his work. In point of fact, when he was subsequently called on to speak or write about the phenomenon of terrorism on American soil, he made a careful effort to draw connections between the research he had already done and the events that both led up to and then unfolded after the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. In other words, he saw a kairotic opportunity for invention, a chance to generate new ideas and questions that didn't exist prior to the attacks. In the best tradition of ancient and classical thinkers, he didn't view this as an opportunity for personal gain at all, but instead as a chance to bring some new knowledge into being, to develop and enhance the discourse that already existed on this subject. So here, Kairos helped him as he worked on that first key term we've been dealing with today, invention. It helped him see how and what to write about next. It's not often that kairotic moments present themselves in such a way as that which my colleague experienced. As the ancient Greeks recognized timing is elusive, and the windows for inventing new ideas and arguments are not always opened so dramatically or completely. Still, they didn't leave themselves entirely subject to the whims of the god Kairos. Interestingly enough, they also suggested that successful speakers, and of course, by extension, this means successful writers, had the capacity to create their own kairotic moments, to open up new ways of thinking about an issue or a topic by actually creating a connection to current conditions and circumstances. They believed that individuals had the power to make their arguments resonate with the major events and questions of their day, even if opportunities didn't readily present themselves at first. In other words, they thought that Kairos could be created to help with invention. They also offered a tool to help make those kairotic moments happen, and this is one that I suspect you're already familiar with, but I also suspect you don't always make full use of this in your writing. And that tool is analogy. An analogy is simply drawing connections and similarities between two things that may not necessarily be associated with each other by a particular audience. If the issue or topic you're writing about doesn't seem to have a kairotic quality to it, you can, in effect, create that kairos for yourself by constructing an analogy that links your idea with something that's part of the current zeitgeist and truly of the moment. Now, this all sounds well and good in theory, but how can you put this analogy thing into practice? How can it be used to create kairos? One of my close friends works for a construction company that specializes in commercial real estate, and specifically warehouses and other large-scale storage buildings. And while her company handles most of the big picture issues, and these are things like acquiring the land, securing building permits, finding tenants, they rely on multiple subcontractors to do a whole lot of the actual construction. And one of my friend's responsibilities was to audit the purchases of the subcontractors, make sure they were buying and using the materials that her company said they had to. At some point, she started to notice that one of the subcontractors was not buying the right kind of fire safety equipment and was not purchasing enough of it to adequately protect structures of the size her company was contracting to build. So in response to this, she wrote multiple emails and memos to the subcontractor, to her supervisors, and she was trying to alert them to this issue, and she was warning them that any short-term savings are going to be more than offset by potential losses they could face if an accident occurred due to the negligence of the subcontractor. Her bosses ignored her warnings, and they effectively gave the subcontractor tacit permission to keep cutting corners. They just sort of looked the other way. And finally, after sending out 4 separate memos on this subject, my friend gave up and she tried a new approach. And what's important here is I should mention that these events were occurring at approximately the same time that the oil company BP was dealing with this huge financial and political fallout from the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon offshore drilling rig. As you'll recall, this explosion cost the lives of 11 crewmen and set off one of the largest oil spills in history. You might also recall that BP leased this rig from another smaller company, Transocean, which also faced potential liability for the disaster. And you might remember that prior to the explosion, employees on the rig had actually noted several violations of safety protocols that management hadn't paid any attention to, no matter how many times they had tried to call their attention to these issues. Okay, so now back to my friend and her dilemma. Instead of sending out a 5th memo, we can all imagine if the first 4 memos didn't do any good, why would the 5th? Instead of sending out a 5th memo to her supervisors and the contractor, she crafted a press release, and she modeled it after some of the press releases that were issued after the oil rig explosion and spill. And we don't have time in this lecture for me to read the full text of her mock press release, but what she did is draw a very clear, very clever, and for her bosses and the subcontractor, a totally unnerving analogy between the BP Transocean incident and what she believed would happen if her company continued to ignore the safety protocol violations that were being committed by the subcontractor. This time, as you might have guessed, her writing efforts were immediately rewarded. The analogy she created with the mock release was so compelling that it was circulated to the highest levels of her company within the span of just 1 business day. On the morning of the 2nd day, the subcontractor was fired. And, even better, my friend received an immediate promotion to head compliance officer. So it was a win-win-win for everybody in this case. The takeaway point here is twofold. First, Kairos is incredibly powerful. The climate in the aftermath of the oil spill in the Gulf was such that no company could afford to be caught ignoring safety protocols for the sake of profit. Second, good writers can create their own Kairos by using analogies to connect their particular subject or issue to something that stands, for better or for worse, at the center of everyone's attention. And in the process, they can invent new arguments that lead to deeper and more meaningful discussion of the issue at hand, and they can get more people to focus on it. Kairos is crucial not only for the invention process, but also for arrangement, meaning it can inspire you to modify or even radically restructure those received formulas and expectations for how such things like a business letter or a memo or a press release should look. Or it can cause you to rethink and revise the terms in the language you might use when you're writing one of these. And I don't at all mean to suggest that the next time you have to compose an urgent email or memo to your boss, you should draw an analogy with a natural disaster or rely on a mock press release. What I do want to suggest here is that moving beyond received models and conventional instructions when the opportunities, circumstances, and timing seem right can be a really powerful way of setting your writing apart, in a good way, from everyone else's. Of course, obviously, there are going to be some risks involved if you're not following standard procedures for composing written work, or for arranging your writing in ways that don't immediately conform to received notions. But it's also true that there are risks in repeating established formulas and following prescribed patterns. And those risks can be considerable as well. How many lost opportunities to stand out from the crowd and catch the attention of readers who might do wonderful things for you and your career? Think about that. How many missed chances to wow somebody with your writing rather than simply pass inspection? As I demonstrated with a story about my college application essay in the first lecture of this series, my first try at that essay was perfect in terms of subject matter and style. It wasn't offensive in any way, there weren't any typos or grammatical errors, it had a logical progression, but it was ultimately too safe. Like I said, I don't even remember what that first essay was about. Probably something about learning how to be an effective leader, blah, 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 blah. In other words, probably just like the gabillion other essays the poor admissions committee was forced to read. Now, my second essay, well, I'm not arguing at all that it was rising to the level of great literature by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm sure that that second essay was definitely more interesting. It was more likely that the admissions officer would remember this one, and that's what I was going for. I didn't want to get lost in the crowd. So, what can you do to not only invent new ideas and arguments, but also create new arrangements for them? Well, an important addition to your writing toolkit should be a permission form, and let's make it an imaginary or a virtual one. And this permission form should state that from this moment on, you are no longer required to begin a piece of writing by crafting the opening or introduction. In other words, don't start at the start. Start somewhere else. The reason is, if you're crafting an introduction to something that you haven't yet written, but perhaps you've outlined or you've thought deeply about it, you're undercutting the possibility that in the very act of writing itself, you might discover or invent, to use the classical rhetorical term, something new and important to say about your topic, issue, or question. You might have encountered this strategy someplace else. Someone advised you to save the introduction until last because, after all, you'll just end up rewriting it anyway. That's a really good piece of advice, but it's also important to understand that there's a deeper rationale for this than simply trying to save yourself some time and energy. The real drawback to writing the opening first is not the time and energy it's going to cost you when you have to go and revise, but rather the intellectual and creative possibilities that are going to be foreclosed when you lock yourself into that introduction writing mode. Taking a top-down approach to writing has the effect of narrowing the field of possible ideas and diminishing the impulse to ask new questions. To be clear, very often, especially with inexperienced writers, narrowing the field is a really necessary thing. It prevents an argument from becoming fragmented or disconnected or wandering off in weird directions. But for more experienced writers, fragmentation and disconnection aren't so much of a problem. So, once you've got your topic in hand and you're fully capable of offering a clear, straightforward analysis and critique, you can easily avoid distracting tangents or underdeveloped points. Or if that's the case for you, or even if it's almost the case for you, well then I give you permission. Indeed, you have every right and reason to push back against conventional arrangement models that call for you to start with an introduction and then move methodically from point to point to point until you reach your conclusion. And at that point, of course, you're going to summarize what you've just told us. Instead of following that pattern, instead, pick a point or aspect of your topic that seems most interesting or challenging and develop that in as much depth as you can. If in the process of developing that point, you encounter or conceive of some new aspect or dimension of your topic, go ahead and develop that next. And don't worry about transitions. You can build those back in later. Your goal should be to use the writing process itself as a means of discovering what elements of an issue or subject deserve the most and best attention. It's only by letting go of conventional formulas and expectations, even if this is only for a short while, that writers can imagine new ways of arranging the arguments and the knowledge they've both invented and discovered. Now, along with the commonplace, stasis, and deductive and inductive reasoning, you've seized the opportunity in the true spirit of Kairos to include the ideas of invention and arrangement in your toolkit of rhetorical terms and concepts. In the next lecture, we're going to expand that toolkit even more by introducing two more concepts, ethos and pathos, that taken together will boost the persuasive power of your writing far beyond its current horizons.